Hi, I'm Todd Baker, President and owner of Logos Counseling Services, and I'm here to bring you your Mental Health Minute. As I think about all that happens in and around us every day, I'm often reminded that it's really easy to fall prey to only seeing the negative side of life. When we turn the TV on, it only takes a minute or two before we're really confronted with many of the harsh realities of life. Today I want to present the idea of being an encourager. I'm reminded of a saying by our favorite Mr. Rogers where he tells a story about his mother telling him to always look for the helpers. Well, we should look for the helpers, but we also need to realize that when we see them, we need to recognize they are not just encouraging and helping others. Today, I want to present the idea of being an encourager. I'm reminded of a saying by our favorite Mr. Rogers where he tells a story about his mother telling him to always look for the helpers. Well, we should look for the helpers, but we also need to realize that when we see them, we need to recognize they are encouraging and helping others. See, we are not just looking for the helpers, but we're also looking for opportunities to be an encourager. The Bible is full of stories and commands about being an encourager. Verses such as 1 Thessalonians 5:11 tells us to encourage one another and build one another up. Or maybe even Hebrews 10:24 and 25 that talks about being concerned for and also encouraging one another. But there are two people in the Bible that I recently ran across during my quiet times that were really unlikely encouragers. Most of us know the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. We may recall how his brothers sold him into slavery, and then God used that circumstance to eventually raise him up to be the chief administrator of Egypt during a 7-year famine across the whole land. All of the Bible doesn't really mention the amount of devastation caused by this famine. It could be assumed that there was a significant loss of life and livestock during this period. But at some point during the famine, Jacob and his family ran out of food. Now, Jacob was Joseph's father. And remember, Jacob thought Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. But they ran out of food, and Jacob knew that there was, or had heard that there was food in Egypt. And so he sent his kids to Egypt to get some rations. During their trip home from Egypt, they realized a sack of money that didn't belong to them was in one of their bags. They feared that someone would think they stole the money, but they continued home anyway. Unfortunately, their rations ran out, and they eventually had to return to Egypt to get more rations. Now, Joseph knew who they were, his brothers were, but his brothers still had not recognized Joseph, again, because they thought that he was sold into slavery and gone. They were scared. During their trip home from Egypt, they realized a sack of money that did not belong to them was in one of their bags. Well, they feared that someone would think they stole the money, but they continued home anyway. Unfortunately, their rations ran out, and at some point, they returned to Egypt to get more rations. Now, Joseph knew who they were. He knew who his brothers were, but his brothers did not recognize him at that time. Well, at some point, Joseph asked the brothers to come to his house for dinner. Of course, his brothers were scared. They thought that maybe Joseph already knew and thought that they had stolen that money. So the Bible tells us that they had actually thought that maybe Joseph was going to overpower them at his house, and then they would eventually become his servants. So what happens is Joseph's brothers went to talk to Joseph's steward in Genesis chapter 43. It starts in verse 19. They told the servant their story about the money, and they returned all of it. But notice the helper here. Notice in verse 23 that the steward responded by encouraging the brothers. He told them it's okay, and then he gently reminded them of the God that they serve, saying that the God of your father has given you treasure in your sack. Wow. Now, that servant didn't know the whole plan. He didn't know everything. But what he did know is that they shared the same God, the God of Israel. The servant didn't know the plan, but he trusted his master's heart, Joseph's heart, and he also trusted God's heart, even in the absence of a plan. Well, the second unlikely encourager is found in the book and story of Jonah. Now, you all recall the story of Jonah and the big fish. We often see the big fish as some fanciful bystander who just happened to swim by with his mouth open. But the second unlikely encourager is found in the book and story of Jonah. You all recall the story of Jonah and the big fish. Sometimes we're lulled into thinking that somehow the big fish was just this fanciful bystander who just happened to swim by with his mouth open. Kind of reminds me of those of us who ride motorcycles while we're not to ride around with our mouths open, because you never know what may fly in there. Poor big fish. Anyway, that fish was influenced by God himself through an answered prayer from Jonah. Anyway, that fish was influenced by God himself in response to a prayer from Jonah. See, Jonah sank in the raging torrent of the sea. And it says in the Bible that his life was ebbing away. In other words, he was dying. When all of a sudden a large fish swallowed him. That same fish, at God's command, then spit him out onto dry land. So who was the helper there? Who was the encourager? I believe that God used a big fish to encourage Jonah to take a good look at his life and begin the process of reconciling his relationship with God. You see, we are definitely in a unique situation in our world, but let's do more than just look for encouragers. Instead, let's be an encourager. We need to find opportunities to influence and impact our friends, our family, and our neighbors. So this week, or even today or this week, I want you to be creative. A few days ago, my children and my wife took to the streets, literally with some sidewalk chalk. By the time they had finished, they had written scripture and notes, not just on the sidewalks around our house, but even on the street where people drive up and down all day long in our subdivision. So be an encourager today, be an encourager this week, and notice those around you who are also doing the same. From myself and the entire Logos team, I challenge you to be that encourager. We wish you the best, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.